Can you remember how different houses looked just a few decades back? Much has changed since safety protocols were introduced in home construction. Let's take a look at some risky choices that made homes unsafe. Starting with asbestos insulation, which was a regular feature of a home in the 1930s to the 1980s. This was until people realized that it might not be the safest feature to have in a home. Asbestos widespread usage first began in the 30s when people discovered how abundant of a natural resource it was. Naturally, people started incorporating the readily available material into different areas of construction, making it a pretty popular choice amongst home contractors. You may be wondering how the dangers of asbestos were overlooked, and the answer to that is simple. When builders began using the material, they found that it had all the makings of a sustainable and profitable product. It certainly did not help that economic perils forced people to look for cheap resources like this material to save money. Soon enough, asbestos insulation boomed because the material was inherently fireproof and great at keeping heat. The popularity was short-lived as people learned that asbestos came with risks like mesothelioma and respiratory damage. Now, who would want to live in a home that was ridden with such risks? Definitely not us. Thankfully, the use of the material was banned in the 1980s, and usage of it in any further properties was abandoned. Asbestos is still a modern risk, however, because thousands of buildings still have dangerous traces of asbestos insulation, according to the EPA. But do not worry, as this practice has been dead for years now. If you thought we were done with unsafe industry practices, brace yourself because we are yet to discuss clay pipes. Clay pipes were popularized because of how effective of a repellent they were. Clay as a material started being used mostly in the 1950s when the American economy was struggling to fix city sewage system projects because of budget issues. Around 60% of the sewerage system was made before this time, however, it was rotting and needed replacements in many areas. Surprisingly, clay was repellent to most of the usual sewage of an American city, which consisted primarily of your usual toxic martini of trashed food, cigarette butts, and liquid waste. Clay pipes happened to be extremely resistant to all of these while also being long-lasting, which is why they began seeing so much use in projects around and after the 50s. Hindsight can be a thing that is hard to grasp in the present moment, though, and people were certainly not at fault for wanting to make the most out of some good pipes. Clay pipes were unfortunately also vulnerable to root growth and invasion, as well as weak to heavy ground traffic, all of which were common in sewage systems across America, so eventually they were replaced too. The dilemma of America would persist in terms of its underground architecture needs, and the next answer was galvanized pipes. Galvanized piping involved using steel pipes that had a coating of zinc to hold strong against any corrosion or rust. Not only were they used in underground sewer systems, but they were also very common in water service lines at the time. A new and sturdier method of transporting water, both necessary and harmful, galvanized piping was first installed in much of American architecture to replace lead pipes in the 50s and 60s. You may be wondering that this solution sounds perfect, so why was it replaced? Well, galvanized pipes were replaced by copper piping in around the 70s, majorly speaking because of dangers like galvanized pipes being prone to building up deposits of minerals. When these materials were released into the water, service lines would contaminate a lot of homes' sources. Next was an issue that resulted from them also being used in lead service lines, which was a decision America regretted. On top of mineral danger, these systems would dirty up your water with lead. Needless to say, the states quickly abandoned this method of plumbing, and we are grateful they did. Unfortunately, lead would continue to be a menace, haunt America in the form of lead paint. The horror that lead paint brought to your home was that, along with contaminating your water, it would invade your walls as well. Most homes that were built in the United States before 1978 contain heavy traces of the stuff, and at the time it definitely made sense. Who would not want a durable paint that has a good shelf life and retains its appearance as part of their home renovation plans? This infatuation led lead paints to dominate the interior design industry as a go-to choice for many home projects. This is before the unfortunate studies started circulating that more and more developmental issues were becoming common with children around the time lead paints were most widely used. America would not find the correlation dangerous until the 70s, though, when there was enough of a performance dip in IQ tests in schools for people to start looking for a potential problem. Before that, white lead paint was responsible for the deaths of workers who made it, and many painters. Based on the evidence that it was a toxic substance, lead paint was finally banned in 1978 and, luckily for us, is still considered a health hazard today. Non-grounded outlets were thankfully something that the government became much more cautious of earlier on and took action even sooner. Banned in 1962 under the NEC, it was more or less really common in most American homes to have ungrounded outlets because the risks were not well studied yet. If you do not know what a non-grounded outlet is, it basically is any electrical outlet that does not have any ground wiring to protect you from the shock. These typically look like two-prong sources and also only had two wires, the one responsible for the heat and a neutral wire. What this meant was that many ungrounded systems were extremely prone to overheating and electrical shocks. If you ever touched one accidentally, left a piece of cloth near an outlet that was overheating, or just fell asleep with your phone on charge, you were in danger of a minor tingle at best and a full-on fire at worst, hence why the NEC made it mandatory for all systems to use grounded systems that had GFCIs, functioning as essentially the third wire which interrupted charges and solved overheating issues. Thankfully, these became the standard. If we are going over wiring hazards, then it is only right to mention knob and tube wiring, which were in pretty regular use in North America as far back as the 1880s. See, the danger from these ones rose from the fact that they had copper conductors that were poorly insulated. Yet they would run all over the ceiling and walls of buildings as well as insulation tubes. If you ever remember those old janky buildings with wiring inside tubes sprawling across the roof, all centered around these weird-looking knobs, you know what we mean. To save costs, most K&T work often had the supply and return wires in different places, while ideally they should be placed right next to each other, both so that they were simpler to understand in building plans and so that they were safer within junction boxes. This was a practice that the NEC replaced this method of wiring with. In those times, it used to be called the Carter system, if you have ever heard your dad whining about modern circuits. God bless them for doing that too, because a lot of headaches are saved as a result today. Radium paint was very famously used in the same time span as knob and tube wiring, but was a risk for casual fashionistas and pilots alike. If that seems like an odd spectrum of potential victims, then you will know why in just a few seconds. Originally, it was invented by one Sabin Arnold von Sohacki in 1908, and it saw some heavy use for a good 30 to 40 years after the fact too. Radium paint was commonly used in the manufacturing processes for aircraft gear and instrumentation, watches, clocks, and just about anything that could sell more bucks if it glowed. Yes, glowed. And that is exactly what the draw of radium paint was as a coating. Often also referred to as luminescent paint, it was both useful and fashionable. However, it would not last for very long. Over a lot of wear and tear, the paint would flake off of surfaces and stay on the skin of people, which sometimes also meant a risk of swallowing it. This caused radiation-related dental diseases and even damaged your jawbones over time. Good thing we have normal watches now, right? There was also a time before the plastics of today were something we saw in our daily lives, and in those days, like the 1960s, we had things like cloth-covered electrical wiring. Today, the standard in any kind of home worth its money is thermoplastic-coated wiring. But before that, people had this rubberized cloth that was used to insulate wires because of how cheap it was and because it was the most effective insulator at the time. Most homes that were constructed in the first half of the 1900s are covered in this stuff, and as a result are riskier. Sometimes the expensive options are worth it, because what you pay for is what you get. And in this case, what America got was brittle wiring that had broken down easily. It was also pretty weak to damage from local wildlife like New York rats. Some systems of this nature had asbestos in them too, and on top of that, it simply just was not too good at its job. Another thing we are glad the United States has moved on from for a better quality of life. Mercury being dangerous is common knowledge for kids these days, but back then, mercury thermostats were something that a lot of people considered okay to have in the house. We cannot blame them, as mercury has features like being great for body temperatures and liquid and vapor readings that benefited a lot of homes. They were the go-to thermostat for any family, especially when people would go baby shopping. Definitely did not help that most stores only had mercury thermostats. So the question that arises is, why did people use mercury in thermostats back then? And the answer that follows is that mercury is extremely sensitive to heat. It expands and contracts in reaction to heat, and as a result, it makes for a great foundation for any kind of temperature device. Not just families, but industrial applications and labs would also use these thermostats in specific. Even in the 2000s, around 14 tons of the stuff would be sold just for use in thermostats annually. Not only is mercury a bad neurotoxin for humans, but it also harms the environment. Mercury contamination would cause degeneration in fish, and people would not often dispose of them responsibly. Additionally, there was also a risk of breaking them and being exposed to it yourself, so most states like California and Rhode Island banned it. If you never knew why good venting systems are literal lifesavers, let carbon monoxide be a lesson. Most homes did suffer from the aforementioned issue of bad ventilation, and even throughout the 1990s to 2005 annually, at least 439 people died from carbon monoxide intoxication. Nationwide, throughout homes that were built in the 1900s, similarly hundreds or even thousands of people suffered from the harmful substance. Carbon monoxide is also dangerously easy to produce because it comes from the burning of any natural fuel. Wood, charcoal, or natural gas, and even kerosene can produce it if it is not properly oxidized. It is extremely normal as a result nowadays for homes to prioritize ventilation so that any sort of burning that goes on does not produce harsh levels of CO. Long-term exposure to the substance also reduced your blood's ability to carry oxygen, which worsened or caused breathing problems in people. Never take your lungs for granted, folks. By now, you must have gathered from this list that older homes are rife with faulty wiring and all kinds of electrical issues. Yes, the allure of a charming, nostalgic vintage two-story home in Brooklyn is definitely something hard to resist. A very reasonable price tag never helps matters, especially for newlyweds looking to purchase their first property or generally relocating on a budget. Many of these homes and buildings do come with faulty wiring. Fuse boxes that only provide 30 to 60 amp service just do not cut it now, and they did not meet standards in the late 1990s either as America's electricity needs progressed. Other issues would consist of low-voltage switches that would have bad wiring beneath the single plating, which often made them very short-lived. Even in recent memory, those lifespans are definitely nearing their end, and most manufacturers stay clear of them now. It also does not help that America had not yet figured out its way with a system of wiring that was safe, effective, and mass-producible in most homes from the last century. This is why we recommend buying properties built at least after the 70s. Another thing that was a usual sight with older structures and homes in particular were wooden shingles, especially if you lived in Northern America. Distinctive enough to be the stereotypical image that pops up in anyone's head when they imagine a very standard American home. Most cartoons even had houses that always had either brick roofing or wooden shingles. If we really talk about history, wooden shingles were common as far back as the start of the 19th century. They faded away from public sight in the 50s to 70s as there was competition from other preferences people had for roofing materials, but they made a comeback. Around the start of the 20th century, America had a phase of revival architecture, and one of the styles it brought back were these. Sadly, the iconic design of a shingle-roofed home came with a lot of cons too, especially relating to fire. In states like California, where wildfires are common, a lot of homes that have these as toppings suffer, and this is because they are really easy to set aflame. Not only that, they do not do well against rough winds, and asphalt shingles in particular crack easily. Makes sense why America moved on to different stylistic choices for their ceilings. Speaking of old homes and toppings, let's talk about their sides as well, which were often adorned with single-pane windows. Now, these were a hot choice both because of the look and for their properties at keeping heat, and many builders thought they were the ideal size for most American rooms in the early 60s to 70s. Single-pane windows would also be much more lightweight than alternatives, so the transportation and installation was always easier. Plus, they came much cheaper than any other option on the market, around a flat 20% actually. Being easy to repair just about tied the bow on a pretty package that made these a hard-to-beat choice for interior design in the 20th century. Unfortunately, what they had in being cost-effective, they sorely lacked in being as proficient with energy consumption. Single-pane windows struggled to keep a home cooler in summers and warmer in winters, and as a result, homes had higher bills. Most caught onto the pattern and started opening their minds to other ideas, even if they were not as good-looking. Since we are covering most aspects of a residence, let's go to the kitchen and check out coal-fired stoves, which were first invented in 1833 but remained popular well into the 90s. Easy to burn with very little soot, these were a very solid kitchen choice that most people picked for any cooking need. Electrical stoves and the like had not become too common and would not break into the mainstream until much later. Coal just could not beat out natural gas and oil, though, and in the 1950s most places left it behind, though just a decade before it still saw some love. While there was never really anything too harmful about a coal stove as compared to some others on the list, they were always at a higher risk of fire accidents and had bad fumes like carbon monoxide. When progress came knocking, people saw that alternatives had a lot more benefits. Unvented gas appliances were an extremely common culprit behind carbon monoxide-related gas accidents in the United States. We spoke about this carbon monoxide poisoning before, but it is probably best to stress again how much ventilation was ignored in homemaking and architecture decades back. Do not get us wrong, the ventilation was there, but never as a primary aspect that builders should prioritize and be extra cautious of. Most people thought that as long as some air could pass through, you were okay. Unvented gas appliances definitely proved ideas like that wrong with how much they contributed to carbon monoxide-related emergency trips and hospitalizations. Grandmas would often have handwritten recipe cards that they would keep passing down through the family, because these were a way to preserve recipes so that even their kids' grandkids could enjoy the delicious things they would whip up. Recipe cards would often be found in binders or small containers, and it was not like a strict step-by-step cooking guide, but a loving tutorial on how to make the most famous recipes Grandma would cook up. This includes Thanksgiving specials, Christmas delights, and Halloween sweets and treats. As you can probably tell, these were keepsakes for a lot of families and still hold a lot of sentimental value. Butter dishes with lids were something that you would find in almost every household. Just like you would walk in most homes today and expect to find a coffee maker or a deep fryer, back then, in the age of our grandparents, butter dishes were very popular ways of storing the spread. You would keep them at room temperature instead of in the fridge, so they were always soft and spreadable, and you would protect them from any dirt. These existed even before the time of accessible and affordable refrigeration, and they were made from glass or ceramic. Usually, they would be pretty fashionable too, with lots of unique designs and ornate detail put into them. Speaking of fridges, how did people preserve things before they came around? Because keeping everything in a prison of ice was not ideal either. See, in those times, people had mason jars with really airtight seals. These became essential for the produce and grocery of the time, which was always vegetables, jam, and jellies. Sometimes families, especially grandmothers, would use them for storing meat, and this symbolized how common canning became after the Great Depression and World War I. Preserving your harvest in a mason jar was about the best and smartest thing you could do for extending its shelf life by a good margin. A fun thing they used to do was water baths and pressure canning in mason jars, which was a big habit amongst gardeners and home chefs. Nowadays, we just do not get cookie jars anymore. It is not like most households do not use them, but in the past, it was a lot more common for people to walk in, see a glass of milk next to a ceramic cookie jar, and then proceed to have an overly sweet and good time. Today, you cannot get that experience because everything comes pre-packaged and made for commercial mass production and sale, focusing on resealable containers that people do not need storage for in other ways. Today, the typical family focuses a lot on being minimal or having glass containers which are better at storing things than cookie jars, but the aesthetic of them was really nice. Percolator coffee pots were what people used to make their dearly beloved coffee before the age of drip coffee makers in the 20th century. This is how you would make some strong coffee, and it was done by cycling boiling water through grounded coffee. It used a basket and a tube to do those, and they became known for three things: being very straightforward to use and brewing incredibly vibrant and strong coffee. They have been replaced by single-serve Keurig machines and espresso makers because you just get more control over what kind of coffee you want to make with them. But to get that old-fashioned coffee, some households do still enjoy a percolator. Butter curlers were another little trinket that saw a lot of use in most households, thanks to the simple benefits of life it would let you enjoy, like very pretty-looking butter. Some home chefs were much more focused on presentation, decoration, and maintaining the ambiance with the look of their food than others. They always had butter curlers handy because at formal meals or dinner parties, this elevated the entire mood because of how good it could make your food look. Homes that had hosting and entertaining as a priority always had curlers around, and nowadays some still use them because of the flexibility it gives you. With butter curlers, you could get more controlled and moderate curls of butter out instead of large spreads that really burned through your stock and had you running to the grocers again and again. The meat grinders of yesterday were known as manual food mincers, and before electrical appliances and prepackaged processed meat took over marts and homes alike, they were a kitchen staple you would find everywhere. Manual food mincers let any kind of family enjoy most kinds of food, like meat, veggies, and dry nuts as well. You could have ground meat or minced, which let them make sausages and burgers, steaks, or pâtés. So you could open up access to dumplings for dinner or a cookout with homemade burgers. A lot of meat stuffing dishes like meatloafs and dumplings were also very popular things to make, so food mincers helped in preparing those, and they were very self-sufficient and economical. Vintage Tupperware was particularly popular in the 1950s and 1960s, and it was known for three things. It was practical, so you could get a lot of use out of it. The designs were fresh, new, and very chic, and they had a sense of style and identity with their use of bright colors. Palettes like mint green and pink were common in the 50s, and most Tupperware also came in stronger, warmer colors like mustard yellow, turquoise, and orange. This led to households always having the chance to design their kitchen and eating space however they wanted, down to the forks, spoons, and bowls, and there was just a lot more variety than you would find today. If somebody said they were bringing out the fancy stuff, you could always be sure you would get some pretty-looking cutlery. We are quite sure that this is a universal human experience that everyone has gone through at this point, whatever corner of the planet you may be from. Sometimes you have to sew something yourself. You ask your mom where the supplies are, she points you to your grandmother, who enthusiastically pulls out a biscuit tin or container of sweets. Maybe you get a little excited and jumpy, as naturally everyone would at the sight of a free sugar rush, but when she pops the lid open, all you see are sewing supplies. Did you ever wonder why they did this? Besides the obvious reason for recycling and reusing things to avoid any unnecessary spending, these tins were also significantly durable and lasted a long time. They were usually always the perfect size as well, and it was as if they were meant to be a permanent home for sewing supplies. Spools of thread, thimbles, needles, and sharp objects all would hold in one box while being very easy to grab when you needed it. Once you were done, you could just put everything back. Grandmas thought that rolling pins were pretty essential to a good baking session. You could not go a day without seeing one be put to use, as it was just a very multi-purpose tool that helped in every way possible. You could flatten dough with them, roll out a pie crust or a tart crust, as well as the doughs for cookies. You could get cookie dough to a very precise thickness with a rolling pin, and many a wonderful batch of gingerbread, shortbread, and red velvet cookies, which were really popular back then, were rolled out thanks to these pins. In the hands of an amateur, they may not be the best tool, but in the hands of a veteran home chef that has been rolling and baking for most of their life, there was arguably no tool better than these pins. If you even needed to make croissants, puff pastry, or donuts, you could use rolling pins. And if you wanted to save a little on birthday costs by baking a cake at home, that was pretty easy thanks to a grandma who knew how to work a pin. Jell-O molds were a typical 20th century snack that let people get creative and fashionable with their desserts. You could use them for gelatin-based dishes or jelly bowls and cakes, and they were very common at parties and family gatherings. Of course, the kids in particular enjoyed Jell-O molds the most out of everyone else, even if they had no idea how to use them to shape the Jell-O properly. That is probably why every grandma always had some of these though, so that when their grandkids eventually did come over, they could enjoy playing around with their food a little before. After all, they would probably get scolded for doing so at home. To be honest, most Jell-O mold brands got really popular in the 1960s in particular as they became a convenient trend since Jell-O was also getting more and more popular. Wooden spoon collections were also a very typical sight in America during the 20th century. A lot of these things got as popular as they did because they lasted so long and were also pretty durable. Nowadays, it is very easy to get a replacement for something if it breaks or something goes wrong, but it was more of an inconvenience then. Wooden spoons didn't melt or warp even with daily exposure to heat, so they were used in nearly every aspect of cooking. Besides the practicalities of all of it, the aesthetic appeal was also really out there. They went along with most of the interior of homes back then, which was pretty wood-oriented, and the rustic charm and warm, dulcet tones of a well-stacked collection of wooden spoons really brought it all together. It's when the little things come together that a place really shines, you know? Crock pots were more or less the slow cookers of the past century, and they were extremely trendy in the 1970s and 1980s. You could pin their skyrocketing popularity on a lot of things, but most of it was that they aligned with the food norms of the time. Slow-cooked roasts and the like were becoming a daily aspect of people's meals once again, and besides that, people wanted to step away from hard and complicated cooking that required you to dedicate a lot of time to being in the kitchen and observing every little thing. Crockpots let you do that by just setting whatever you had on the stove and forgetting about it for a while as it slowly cooked, so you could tend to other work, chores, or just some much-needed relaxation time without any worries. One-pot meals also were some of the most widely consumed things people had, with stuff like casseroles and soups being a typical American lunch back then. Also, people really appreciated what it did for the flavor. The United States is largely a meat-eating country, and slow cooking really enriches the flavor of anything you are working with. Floral china had a bit of a renaissance in the 20th century, and those crockpots always looked good with it. This was because Victorian design trends started having a big focus on ornate and floral prints, and china manufacturers listened as soon as the trend popped up. They wanted to put out more and more floral designs to attract more of an audience, and they especially wanted to get ahead early in the rat race involving dinnerware sets. These sets started becoming very widespread, and most would come with floral designs, and it was like a whole new market with untapped sales for a lot of producers. As a result, you had every house loaded with matching fine china sets that always looked like a painting, or had every kind of flower you had seen in your life on a different plate. Something that was really common as a bit of decoration in households back then was a teapot. In a sense, it has lost the same love it had in its golden days where people only used teapots for storing their freshly brewed tea, since microwaves are so incredibly common now. They were common in rural areas as well, which is likely where teapots became part of the cottagecore aesthetic. They were also used to brew tea, as you could steep tea leaves in them and let the hot water really soak in all of the flavors and aroma. Teapots came in different shapes and sizes, and you could always experiment and see which one worked the best for you. Candy dishes would usually always be filled to the brim with wrapped sweets, especially if we are discussing the holiday season. As soon as you had October roll around, people would start preemptively planning their best Halloween ideas and what candies they were going to get to fill up the dishes this year. Many even had really decorative designs to them, like colorful or cut glass and spooky patterning. It was all a part of setting up the vibe of your home back in the day. Going out shopping for new and in-style candy dishes is a thing of the past now. But when people engaged in this activity, it was a bonding event for families. So was emptying those dishes every week, by the way. The pressure cooker was first invented in the 17th century, but most people began associating it with the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when stews became extremely common. Commercial mass production of pressure cookers began around this time, with the first one, the MBG, made in a Chicago factory in 1930. Due to high demand from home chefs, including stay-at-home wives and grandmothers, these cookers quickly gained popularity in the market. You could reduce cooking time with them, and they used a lot less energy than most conventional methods. As a result, people really took to these neat little things. One of the best parts was that it retained two of the most important things about your food better than anything else, which was the flavor and the nutrients. Pressure cooking helped keep more nutrients in your food as it used less water overall, and the tightly sealed environment helped keep evaporation on the down low, and it was really good for handling tough cuts of meat. Something you would always find in your grandma's kitchen besides a pressure cooker, a teapot, and freshly baked gingerbread was a cake stand to display all her baked goodies on. These stands in the 90s were the go-to purchase if you wanted to always have your baking on display, especially if you had a flair and sense for style and presentation. Most grandmas definitely did have that and still do, so you can see why this would get so popular. Also, it made getting dessert a lot more accessible since all you had to do was go to the stand and get the already sliced and served cake, pastry, or Danish waiting for you. The decorative appeal went for days, though. You could have these in any kind of color, size, material, and design you wanted. The best part was how the design and function always bounced off of each other. Like if they had the space for 3 to 5 cakes each, they would feature more open designs. If they were made of porcelain or glass, then they would be painted cooler colors, and companies worked with each other to make sure that the designs of their products complemented the other. Recipe books with tabs was a really practical habit that grandmas retained throughout their tenure as the best cook in the entire family. Back then, you did not have a notes app or the ability to switch between 120 Google Chrome tabs, but you had to keep your favorite recipes in easy access anyway. Recipe books were also something that grandmas in general would make pretty often because they wanted to preserve their best hits and pass them down for their kids. And their absolute favorites would often be marked with colorful tabs. It also helped to keep things organized according to the situation at hand. Sometimes, you needed an appetizer or a side dish quickly, and you didn't have time to flip through the entire book to locate it. In times like those, it was great to have a recipe book with tabs. We have gone through most of the things that you would find in a kitchen, table, or a typical 90s home, but one last thing that arguably is the one most associated with the time period are those funky salt and pepper shakers with lots of shapes. You had cylindrical ones with rounded tops, and these were the most typical. Then you had the ones that were square or rectangular, and that's about all we have for the basic shakers. The fun starts at the ones shaped like animals, which kids and grandparents alike adored. Birds, cats, dogs, whales, and a lot more were available, so every family could have its animal of choice. It was common to get salt and shakers that resembled the family pet too. Saturday morning cartoons are not really something that people are unfamiliar with even in today's generation, but the long-held ritual has definitely become less relevant over time. A lot of this is because of streaming services and internet websites having every kind of media that a child would want to consume. Also, kids back then did not have social media or YouTube, so these cartoons really were as good as it got for many. If you had leftovers, especially pizza, from a Friday family dinner, then it was the perfect start to a weekend. One reason this became such a widespread tradition is because appointment television was very common. This was due to TV programs having specific timings and slots, like 7 a.m. for Scooby and Scrappy-Doo or 10 a.m. for Jabberjaw. Once you missed the assigned slot for these shows, you had effectively missed an episode, and there was not a way to catch up either. What are some of your favorite shows from the heyday of the 70s? When your usual dose of television was not available, you had Pet Rocks, courtesy of Gary Dahl, a collectible toy line that consisted of these rocks which were packaged in custom cardboard boxes, and they even came with little holes for ventilation. There was straw bedding that was used to imitate a pet carrier, and they became extremely popular. The Pet Rock was first released in 1975, and people would buy them as gifts or joking pranks. They made for pretty cheap gifts too, as you could get them at like $3.95 a piece at most convenience stores. After they got released, they sold 5 million in just 6 months, so it definitely got some traction in the market. As far as toys go, there were a lot more boring things to play with than stone pets you could collect. It made for a pretty humble brag too when you had all the collectibles and your friends came over. Most people's idea of a fun time was watching Star Wars when it came out in theaters. So imagine how much fun it was to be a kid going with your family, getting the largest popcorn and drink along with first-row seats. Star Wars was one of the biggest things about the entire decade of the 70s, considered now to be one of the most big-time franchises ever. When the first one came out, families and singles alike wanted to see what the hype was. A New Hope was an accurate title for the film that would spawn a series which continuously restored people's faith in the blockbuster and cinema experience. When it first came out in 1977, movies suddenly became the hottest thing once again. It also made the producers a literal mountain of gold, as the production was just $11 million, but the profit was $775 million. Kids built a box office record that still is considered one of the most historical ones ever by insisting their parents go to the theaters with them just to catch this movie. Speaking of media that defined a generation, watching The Wonderful World of Disney when it ran from 1969 to 1979 was definitely an experience that people will thoroughly remember long after our time too. The show was just that good, ranking in the top 20s regularly and being one of the most popular Disney projects to date. It was especially popular with children and captivated them as they watched with eyes glued to the screen. The story and premise of the show was very episodic, with a different story being showcased each time. Many of the fan-favorite ones were things like the Disneyland story, the True Life Adventures, and the Man in Space miniseries. Nowadays, you can just search this up on YouTube or get a file downloaded in high quality, but back then, kids would make sure to do all their chores and studying on time so they would not miss a beat of the wonderful world of Disney, and we cannot blame them. We have all heard tunes and carols during the snowy season, but Christmas caroling is largely considered a lost now, with its golden days being in the 70s. Children would rehearse for days on end in church and at home for the perfect synced-up melody that they could spread all over the neighborhoods. This was so common that the activity typically made a cameo in most films that were shot in winter, like some of the Home Alone movies. People really did always expect to see kids caroling famous Christmas songs, and hearing A Silent Night being echoed by various groups of Santa's little elves is a core memory both children who grew up during that time and adults from that era can look back on vividly. It was just that popular of a tradition, and it was pretty safe to send your child out singing with the rest of their friends throughout the neighborhood too. Maybe they would come back with some cookies, eggnog, or a nifty Christmas present, but they would always come with a big fat smile on their face. That little period of childhood when you wholeheartedly believed in visits from the Tooth Fairy was truly another world in retrospect. Sure, all of us would know the truth sooner or later, that there was never any fairy with incredibly personal transport, but only your mom and dad with what they could get you from the store. Sometimes that was a present to really solidify your belief in the generosity of the supernatural. And sometimes it made you think why a fairy would know about the latest Power Ranger action figures. Either way, waking up to a present or some money made the pain of losing your teeth for the first time something to look forward to rather than hate. Kids would always happily start thinking about what they wanted as soon as they felt a tooth shaking. And we think that is an incredible flip on the narrative. An otherwise unpleasant experience turned into a happy childhood memory, all via a lie that we just conveniently agree to keep every generation? Who says people cannot work together? Another festive occasion that always brought out droves of excited kids was the 4th of July, especially with all the fireworks, a custom we still uphold regularly. An entire generation of 70s to 80s kids have fond recollections of going to the store with their parents, picking out the perfect fireworks and setting them off as soon as the clock hit 12 and it was the 4th. With the amount of people who would fire off colorful explosions in the sky, the nighttime was a scene to behold for anyone, and a picture-perfect sight that lots of Americans would not forget even as they grew up. In fact, some of the best family moments happen when kids set off the precious fireworks they spent their entire weekend gathering and revel in the fun of the night. The 4th of July is definitely an occasion where lots of people have days they will not be forgetting. Not just children, but as a child, the fun factor is definitely 10 times more grand. You may have heard a lot about Sunday school and not know exactly what it is, but for those who do know, and even more so, for our viewers who continuously went every weekend, community potlucks were something else. It was not necessary to be a Sunday school student. If you helped out at a church as a kid or had one in your neighborhood, you would experience the joy of a community potluck. These were the closest things to communal kitchens that America ever had, and they involved a community of people sharing all their food resources and having one grand meal. The idea took off pretty fast after the Great Depression from the 30s to 50s, and by the 70s it was an established facet of American culture. In those struggling times, and even in the 70s when the economy had not entirely recovered, people thought it was much more efficient to share their resources and make big meals that could feed entire communities, as individual homes did not have enough to sustain their families more often than not. While it is a habit that has vanished from the American people by now, we would definitely like to see something this festive come back. Listening to the sound of ice cream trucks passing by was not just something you saw in cartoons and commercials. It was a way of passing the evenings and relaxing as a child that almost everyone took part in. Maybe you did not realize just how soothing this was as a kid, when you would always be in a carefree mood, but if you hear them now and your head flashes back to younger days, then you are the kind of person we are referring to. Ice cream trucks would regularly patrol neighborhoods, often taking the same routes each day, making sure they always hit up their top-selling customers. As soon as the sound would make its way into your home, an innocent excitement would bubble up immediately in your heart as you sprang out of bed, clutching the last of your allowance and blowing it all on your favorite soft-serve flavors. Ice cream trucks are not too popular now because you can get everything through Uber Eats. And ice cream bars are more of a trendy thing these days, but no one will forget the importance of the ice cream truck, a way of filling your sweet tooth cravings that pioneered the way for so many other kinds of ice cream-related goodness. Just like the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One laid claim to an entire decade of gaming and cemented themselves as the go-to consoles of the 2010s, the 70s had the Atari 2600. A lot of children will remember playing classics like Pitfall, Battlezone, Solaris, and Asteroids. In 1972, Pong came out, which gave the console a lot of hype and even sold a lot of Ataris. It was kind of like how Sony would put Bloodborne on every PlayStation 4 as a package deal, which genuinely did work in selling hundreds of thousands of consoles. That same marketing scheme worked for the Atari, but beyond convenient combos and an impressive library, the Atari 2600 was a leap in technology that allowed for all kinds of new gaming experiences, especially in the platforming genre. A lot of these were just the kind of dopamine rush that children craved in their day to recover from a sickening morning spent in school cramming fractions and the names of different animal species. They also were great to play with a friend, and some of the most popular games of our time first came out on this console, like the timeless Pac-Man. Yes, that same Pac-Man going down in a line, devouring everything in sight. Today, an Atari 2600 video game or console would be a vintage item, but back then it was a must-have for most middle-class kids. At the very peak of the disco craze that overtook much of the 20th century were the 70s, a time when literally everybody was going out to the disco. It was the precursor to the raves and Coachella festivals of today. One of the ways that people found new experiences in the usual glam of the disco ball as they danced the night away was through roller discos. These were essentially skating rinks where the dancers would wear these flashy, pop-themed disco skates, and most of the music would be disco music. Historically, at least, most of the music selection would be disco-themed or in the same genre, with the occasional dance ballad or pop track put on. Some clubs would even pay rock bands like Lynyrd Skynyrd and Blue Oyster Cult, which is definitely not something you would expect to hear when going out on the town for a night of skating around in flashy lights. This was the way people partied it up in the 70s, and roller discos were popular enough that many artists even relied on them playing their latest releases for promotion. Traditionally, people would wear inline skaters, but one thing that these places were notorious for was how unique everyone's sense of style and fashion was. They resurfaced in the 2000s, but roller discos are sadly mostly a bygone trend of the past now. Today, we have gadgets like iPads and tablets to fulfill our artistic needs, but back then, Coloring books was all everyone wanted. Just you, your new coloring book, and some crayons would make every kid's day. Many brands recognized how popular coloring books were becoming and started producing their own variants of the basic coloring book. Major companies like Barbie, Marvel, DC, and even sports teams created books with unshaded characters that children could bring to life with their color pencils and crayons. This was the time when gifting a coloring book to a child was considered hip, not old-fashioned. Alas, like every old trend, coloring books started to lose their cool in front of digital coloring pads and digital art tablets like the iPad, where you have any and all art utensils available to you digitally. Coloring books are still available, but rarely used by children anymore. Drive-in movies were such a big part of the culture of the 70s, and some of the most popular movies in the history of the United States of America first came out as drive-in movies. We are talking about titles like Night Drive, Drive-In, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and more. All of these are peak moments of the 70s, and each title on its own sold out theaters across the nation. But what about when you wanted to have a more comforting experience watching a movie but still wanted to go out? Sure, to scratch that kind of itch nowadays, you have things like Netflix and 123 movies, as well as every restaurant in your vicinity on your phone screen. But in the 70s, you had to go to drive-in movies to get this kind of fun. People would enjoy B-movies in massive parking lots with many others, under a romantic open sky on a big screen. However, you might be thinking that this does not really sound like something that would attract lots of kids because it sounds like a setting for young middle-aged adults. That could not be further from the truth, as kids would explicitly beg their parents to skip the cinema and go catch a drive-in movie with their favorite burger. It was a one-of-a-kind experience that we can only look back on now, as drive-in movies are largely forgotten. Neighborhood barbecues were pretty similar to potlucks, in that they gave a sense of community to neighborhoods that we often do not see today. Well, who can blame us either? The real estate market is quite fast, and your neighbors move out faster. Back then, people still got to know their neighbors and threw barbecues that would have the whole block over. Kids would fight over ribs and who would get to work the grill before eventually being distracted by their parents so they could actually get started on some serious grilling. The aroma of smoked meat and the perfect ranch or dressing would cover the entire vicinity, with all of it being a scene right out of the ending of a Fast and Furious movie. It was so common in the 70s and 80s for people to really spend time with their neighbors and let their kids get to know each other too. People who grew up in the 70s might remember how they would play with their neighbors in parks or their backyard, and a big part of building that kind of relationship were these homely barbecues. The Cave of Time, The Journey Under the Sea, Space and Beyond, and your code name is Jonah. Do any of these ring some bells? They were a part of a book series known as Choose Your Own Adventure, and the entire purpose of them was to be interactive books which would let readers pick their own endings. In a way, these books walked so the role-playing genre could run. I guess Dungeons & Dragons lovers have these to thank in some way, since they popularized media with strong narratives that still allowed for personal choice to add to the fun. These were a type of book known as game books, and they were specifically aimed at children. Each of the stories were from a second person's point of view, and the reader would be the protagonist of the story. The choices they picked out of what the game book offered them were what decided the eventual ending readers would end up with. These really were the prototype for RPG games, since most video games like that today follow the same blueprint. These game books were a marvel back then and were probably the only instance where you could get a child to enthusiastically interact with a book. They have passed into American history now, but if you remember playing some of these, you know how good they were. It is time to let the curtain fall, just as it did on all of these beloved aspects of the 70s. If you had fun while watching this video, then subscribe and hit the like button. Smoking in a plane, for instance, is an action that really gets your danger warnings blaring. When you book a flight these days, you might think that a ride through the skies with full autonomy and privacy is something preserved tightly for the rich people who can smoke in first class. While not entirely the same, back in the 1970s at least, the people back in economy could still enjoy a puff to pass the time while they flew around. You would be surprised at how usual it was for people to smoke on planes. We know your first thought might be, but what about the kids? And long story short, most of them just dealt with it, and people were considerate enough to be mindful of them. Definitely something that spiced up those dull plane rides through blue horizons, but it makes sense why we cannot do stuff like this anymore, given the safety risks on planes and to other passengers. Imagine triggering someone's asthma 10,000 feet up in the sky because you could not go a few hours without your nicotine hit. Speaking of smoking, another crowd that would unwind via substances were pregnant women drinking and smoking. Today, pregnant women are not just discouraged from smoking or drinking, rather they are medically bound not to do so. In the wild times of the 1970s, however, it was a common misconception amongst people that these actions did no harm to the baby. You may wonder why people did not just realize this was a bad idea if they had any concern about the health of a soon-to-be-born baby, but pregnancy can be stressful, and women had to cut back on the migraines somehow. Smoking and consuming wine was how a lot of them coped and unwound in their private time. Naturally, as anti-smoking campaigns picked up an aggressive speed in America and an entire generation grew up with them, these ideas of relaxation thankfully went away from the public's mind. You might have heard your elders going on and on about how back in their day, kids would just go out and play in the streets instead of being glued to screens all day. Sorry to burst your bubble, but there is a lot of truth to that, and parents were significantly more carefree with letting their kids from the house in the neighborhood in the 70s. Spinning the block with your friends who would usually be the neighbor's kids was a common hobby. Kids grew up that way, and a lot of parents thought it helped keep them active and social, but they did not consider how it essentially exposed them to the unpredictable outside world. With literally no supervision, the next time your parents say something like that, maybe ask them about some horror stories they may have heard. With more incidents of children being exposed to sexual assault crimes or violence or cases of kidnapping, curfews definitely got tighter. On the topic of parents, in a lot of states in the USA, it was common to sit on your mom or dad's lap while they drove you to school or picked you up and maybe take the wheel for a bit. The thought process behind this one was basically just, they are going to be driving someday, so why not start them early? It's best to get them accustomed to the road and the driver's seat while puberty sets in, you know? Unfortunately, part of how the world can defy your expectations is how quickly something can happen on the road. You would genuinely be surprised at how many car accidents were caused by kids just taking the wheel for a few seconds. One inattentive driver here, another overly excited kid there, and you had the recipe for a car wreck. This fairly risky public habit is something we can happily say is better off not ever being a valid idea again. Despite what you may think about hitchhiking and how safe or unsafe it is, people in the 70s knew the risks and the pros. Knowledge would not stop them from hitchhiking their way onto higher and steeper trails in the name of adventure. Some would do it to escape the modern world and cleanse their spirit or touch some grass. It is good for the soul, you know? See, the thing about hiking is until you do it, you do not realize how scary it can really be. All those Cartoon Network shows painted a pretty picture, but on an actual hike, it takes one badly placed step. Just one careless step that could at best lead to a couple hundred in medical bills, and at worst, your body not being found. Thankfully, actual hiker communities in the States started becoming places of resources for people who wanted to get into the hobby, making it more safer. Speaking of children and safety, another common risk to toddler security was letting them stay in the back of pickup trucks. In the 1970s, there was an estimated death rate of 10 children for every 100,000 kids that suffered car accidents. Today, we know better than letting our kids sit in the back of pickup trucks without safety. We would not really blame the parents either, because after so much whining, a harmless backseat breezy ride with your child being visible in the rearview mirror does not seem so bad. Except the problem and danger arose when parents would leave common sense with the kids in the back. Naturally, the logical thing to do would be to seat an adult, or at least someone who could keep a watchful eye over them. Most parents would leave their children unrestrained, which spelled disaster in more languages than we know how to speak. After one too many local news headlines, people finally awoke to the concept of caution. You might remember lawn darts or jarts as they were the equivalent to Candy Crush back then. Ever seen those cartoon gags where somebody has to shoot an apple off of a person's head? While throwing lawn darts in your backyard was not exactly as dramatic as that, it was still something that caused more than its fair share of injury. You can blame that one entirely on the people that let kids access metal-tipped lawn darts that could actually pierce human skin when thrown with any decent force. Plus, have you seen kids around darts? They throw those things like they have money riding on whether or not they get a bullseye. We are sure you can imagine what may have followed next in a typical 70s afternoon spent engaging in harmless fun. Many unwarranted trips to the ER and another childhood scar story to the collection that you could brag about at Thanksgiving? Since we are on the topic of easily preventable injury, cars with no seatbelts are one more 70s trend that in good conscience we cannot get behind. Just to get a cheaper deal on a janky old Nissan, people would skip out on seatbelts or take cars with barely functioning belts. What they were probably thinking is they would have reflexes quick enough to use their arm as a makeshift belt to protect whoever was on the passenger side. What we can tell you for a fact is that superheroism should be left to Marvel and DC, as today, every driving school teaches you to buckle up before any drive. People back in the day were not adequately taught the dangers of not wearing a seatbelt, which led to increased fatal car accidents. But today, there is a federal law that dictates that you must be wearing a seatbelt while driving. Similar to the previous entry, and so many more on this list, we have children playing with chemistry sets, which sounds harmless enough in theory. It starts getting anxiety-inducing when you introduce actual harmful chemicals into sets that are marketed towards children. Mind you, most of these were kids who were just beginning to take chemistry in school and had not even fully gone over the periodic table yet. Sure, give them a full chemistry kit with which they can produce hazardous substances because kids are just known for their cautious approach to whatever plaything you give them, right? Sadly, people would learn the hard way how harmful a chemistry class in practice can be. Due to lack of caution taken by companies to advertise the risk of their sets, many people suffered the impact of what they thought was harmless learning. Today, we will not suffer the same fate as consumer laws dictate that any product with chemicals in it should be sold with a safety guideline and warning. People over the years started incorporating basic safety guidelines on a more grassroots level, but riding bicycles with no helmets on. There are many easier and more productive ways to get a concussion if you ask us, like signing up for a Muay Thai regimen near you, but the 70s is all about its love of bikes and BMX tricks. Skate parks that would commonly be used for kids to practice their tricks and stunts would be taken over by kids on their bicycles, eager and determined to polish their skills at the cost of their own skulls. As you may have already guessed, a lot of this activity was not under parental supervision. Remember how we talked about kids just roaming around freely? One of the ways they would have fun while out and about was on their bike and without the proper gear. One more precaution that people forgot and establishments allowed were trampolines without safety nets. If you think you know how high a person can go on one of these, trust us when we say the upper limits of a trampoline are not to be messed with. We all love to pretend we can pull off Spider-Man levels of mid-air flexibility, but let's be honest, if you fumble even one bounce, your entire momentum is gone. What happens next is a walk-in invitation to many kinds of injuries that could be prevented if safety nets were in place. Sadly, today's fun over tomorrow's future was a pretty popular mantra to live by in the 70s. So you had trampoline and amusement parks with people lined up just ready to bounce sky high with no reassuring safety to fall back to when they touched the ground. Pogo balls were something that came around in the late 70s and managed to capture the heart of every toddler in each state of the USA. However, fun toys are often either poorly designed or not at all safe, and pogo balls were a mix of the two. What were intended to just be simple rubber balls fixed onto a plastic platform ended up being very touch and go. Pogo balls inherently were not dangerous, especially if you used them outdoors and did not get too wild with your throws. Kids sadly often took to playing with them inside residences and in cramped spaces where they have a lot of potential things to crash into. These can be a real menace. Many vases had fallen victim to the whimsical trajectory of these balls, which nobody could ever predict given how bouncy they were. We learned quickly that some things should really be kept only to the outside. Clackers were another toy that got a bad rep because of some manufacturing decisions that could have spent a lot more time in the drafts. Clackers started out as these glass sphere balls attached to a string that you could just whip around, but glass is glass, and strings are volatile. So you had a toy that was fun to abuse and weak to any kind of punishment, since clackers would shatter so easily, sending dozens of shards of glass into the skin of people nearby. At best, these would cause tiny cuts, but if they went in a person's eye or an equally sensitive spot, then they could potentially be a serious visit to the emergency room. Hence why the company behind clackers came out with new models in the early to mid-70s that replaced the balls with plastic, unbreakable ones. A simple design choice like this could have saved it so much bad publicity, while also not being an unnecessary source of stress for parents. Moon shoes were an attempt by Nickelodeon to capture the next big trend before it got out of their hands, essentially so they would have a monopoly on it. Moon shoes had a pretty simple idea. What if you could have trampolines in your shoes? And so they came up with these funky shoes that had exposed metal strings in them. Moon shoes were awfully bouncy, and finding your balance while wearing a pair of these heels made them look like cakewalks. However, finding your footing was not the most dangerous part about these shoes, as that honor was taken by the metal strings, which were the basis of the whole idea. Leaving them unexposed meant a lot of preventable ankle injuries, and do not get us started on how easy it was to trip and fall while you were in these. Essentially, they flopped badly and did not become the trendsetter the company was hoping for. For the outdoor American who loved spending time in nature's lap of luxury, wood-burning kits were a must-have purchase. In the early 70s, a very adventurous spirit took over the masses of America as it called them to the woods in search of a down-to-earth weekend. Lots of the people who often went on these camping trips, which more often than not ended up being solo ventures, would be going out camping for the first time. Not equipped with any real outdoor experience, they would purchase these kits impulsively, thinking they would dramatically boost their experience in the wilds. Sadly, all they did was cause light burns, because you still need to know how to work a kit and not just buy one. In the hands of inexperienced trekkers, they were more of a hazard than a safety tool in those situations. No child car seats was the standard for American vehicles in those times, and that added a lot of risk for your baby in the back seat. Child car seats are specifically designed to keep children safe in crisis situations and to reduce the brunt of any impact. This helps to keep the child safe from any severe or lethal wound and provides some sort of cover. Why something this necessary did not take off until much later in America's history is beyond us, but the common car typically never included these. Most people did not even see the point in buying one either, seeing it as a useless and expensive purchase when the child was doing just fine. Sadly, some experiences do not stick until they are felt firsthand, and we can only hope for those of you watching that you have no relatable memories of what we are talking about. Another way people would often cut costs were those nifty chemical lawn sprays, which seemed to do the job if all you had was a very minor bug problem. For any real infestation, though, all people were doing was making matters worse and exposing their family to harmful pesticides. You know, there are very good reasons as to why fumigators ask you to move out of the premises while they work, and for a few hours after that too. It is so that these toxic chemicals can do their job and settle to the point that they are not a risk for humans. Spraying them without a care in the world in your backyard was simply a disastrous idea, and many rounds of DDT killed plants, bugs, and put family members in the hospital alike. People were not resorting to do-it-yourself versions of professional procedures for no reason, and using lead paint was one of those nasty but common habits. America was still not economically well, and most homes were not worrying about budgets for no reason. Wherever work could be done by a member of the household instead of hired labor, it was done. People would skimp out on going the whole 9 yards with their interior decoration plans and grab some lead paint, getting busy on the walls themselves. What was not common knowledge was that lead paint can cause extreme damage to the human body. Developmental damage, nervous system issues, and problems in your kidney. Lead is used in paints to help it dry faster and resist corrosion, and it is extremely unsafe for humans. Imagine having your entire home exposed to the substance. We end this list with a cautionary tale as old as time, and that is to never kick back and relax while there is no supervision at playgrounds. Not only was this a prime situation for children to cause injuries to each other, it also helped increase incidents of physical bullying. Kids felt like they could get away with it since there was no adult to rein them in. No consequence means free permission over the playground to the brains of most 9 to 12-year-olds, and that can be a pretty dangerous environment for some children in class. Parents would often just leave their kids at playgrounds without any kind of watchful eye and go about their business or chat the hours away with a friend while their kid exhausted themselves, all the while being blissfully unaware of what may be happening right under their noses.